Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I am going to break down allyship, advocacy, and activism. If you're not sure of kind of how the work that you might be doing fits in within those categories, or maybe you're interested in getting involved behind a particular cause and you want more information about what that looks like on different levels, this video is for you, so stay tuned. So let's start first and foremost talking about allyship. This is a word that I'm sure that you've heard very often, and typically the word ally is used in context or in relationship to the LGBTQIA+ community. So individuals who don't identify, for example, as gay or transgender or pansexual or asexual or another kind of identity that's within that kind of umbrella terminology are supportive of that group, and that they are aware of the harassment and discrimination that that particular community experiences across society. So that's typically the context that people use the term ally, but you can use it in reference to any community that is being marginalized. An ally is someone who is consciously avoiding engaging in behaviors that will oppress other groups. Discriminatory behavior, biased behavior, prejudiced behavior, that will be harmful to other groups and other communities. And they're also acknowledging that that community experiences oppression in multiple different forms. Individuals, for example, that say things like, I don't see color, if we're talking about racial justice, right? If they say they don't see color, then you're not even an ally, because allyship requires that you recognize that communities of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are experiencing racism from an individual and a systemic perspective. The issue and the challenge and the limitations with allyship that I think a lot of people kind of ignore is that allyship is really not an actionable space. It really is saying that I think racism is bad. I am not going to be racist. I'm not going to hold racist perceptions and views. I'm not going to engage in racist behavior. But I really am going to stop short of actually trying to disrupt and dismantle racism. Understanding that things like policy change are required in order to address some of the systemic forms of bigotry that exist in our society. So advocacy really takes the form of these organizations and coalitions. Nonprofits are critical in this space. Nonprofits are pretty much designed and really born out of the space of addressing a social a social problem, and being able to bring attention to that issue. So that means that advocacy happens by way of fundraising is a huge part of that, because of course we know money talks. A really important component of advocacy is education. So again, thinking about nonprofits, a lot of what they also do is not just gathering folks together, they serve as these clearinghouses for information about their particular cause. That's the first step, is to get you to pay attention, but then once you're paying attention, there needs to be some education that's happening. So now we shift over into looking at activism. The way that activism typically takes form and takes shape is by way of demonstrations and protests. And there are a number of different examples for what those can look like. They might take on the form of boycotts and strikes. The labor movement, a lot of unions that will go on strike to say, we are protesting the conditions that we are expected to work in. They are unfair, they are inappropriate, they are unconstitutional. The way that we are going to get the attention of the system that we work in is by just literally not showing up to work. Very effective. Boycotts, of course, thinking about the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, and how influential that was from a fiscal perspective. Boycotts are really important for that reason. It's because they start to like get in the pockets, right? This is like the business case for activism. Unfortunately, because we live in a capitalist society, capitalism says that the loudest and quickest way to get attention around a cause is to hit the pockets, right? To really impact the income and the revenue generation of big organizations and companies and just the larger systems in general. Either talking to them about how you can save them money if they were more equitable and inclusive, or really hitting them in the pockets and saying, we are not going to buy your products anymore, use your services anymore. We're going to tell 10,000 other people not to do that, and they're going to tell 15,000 more. You're going to have to compromise to what it is that we're calling for. A really impactful and important protest that happened in form of activism that took place earlier this year is when a lot of Black creators boycotted TikTok, right? To say this platform, right, and this algorithm within the platform is racist, is pushing to the forefront content by white creators. It's pushing to the forefront content by white creators that they are replicating or stealing from Black creators, but the Black creators are not visible. Oh, we're not having it, we're going on strike, right? And we saw what happened with that. There weren't any dance crazes that, you know, popped up during that time. Nothing was going viral in the same way. And so that was just a clear demonstration to say that this is not us saying that we think we're influential. We can prove it to you. In the US, it really is the First Amendment to the Constitution that protects your right and kind of serves as that guarantee that you have the right to kind of speak out and express your views. And you also have the right to assemble. So that is really kind of the context that a lot of policy and law is really built around in terms of what protesting looks like. That First Amendment right is really the strongest and most effective when you are occupying or located and kind of organizing and gathering in public spaces. So think about streets and sidewalks and government buildings. In terms of protesting in front of government buildings, the biggest piece is the access to the building, right? If you're deemed to be blocking access to that building, then there might be some law enforcement engagement from that degree. But being able to organize and assemble on a public level is really where that First Amendment right is most impactful, to be able to gather and to kind of talk about your cause and really rally the troops very literally in that space, in a public space. When you think about private property in the US, it's really heavy on, you know, owners being able to make decisions for their property. But if you have the expressed permission of a private property owner, then of course that's very different. This also extends to counter protest. So if you are organizing a rally around racial justice and there is some counter protest that pops up, they are also equally allowed to assemble, right, and to express their views. And the police are supposed to approach and treat protesters and counter protesters the same. That has to look equitable. And that's a really important thing to recognize. If you go to counter protest a particular assembly that you think is inappropriate or a cause that you think is racist, it's important that you know that you're allowed to do that in a public space and that you should be treated the same way that the other protesters are being treated as well. If you are in a public space, then you have the right to photograph anything that's in plain view. And this includes the police. You have every right to photograph the police. Right? A lot of people, you know, where they kind of start to get into the gray area with is this conversation around interfering with official police duty. And that's usually something that law enforcement will kind of utilize to be able to get you to stop engaging in the photographing or filming them. But you have the right in plain view in a public space to photograph anything that you are witnessing. And we see how critically important this has become. I mean, literally, it has been used and been the deciding factor in so many court cases, right? In so many situations where people have been killed. And all there was to rely on was really the word of law enforcement officers because the other individual is dead. Right? And so oftentimes now with this ability to have cell phone video, it really has changed the game. But unfortunately, it's also what led to, in a lot of ways, this conversation or usage of body camera footage, right? When people recognize that you do need this like video evidence, it is very strong and it does really tell a very different story than sort of verbal, right? He said, she said, despite this cell phone footage being readily available, oftentimes it is still a challenge because we're talking about systemic oppression. We're talking about systemic racism oftentimes in law enforcement. We're talking about really pushing up against a system. And again, that's why it's important to manage expectations if you're engaging in activism, because you might think that you have a smoking gun, right? It's like, oh, this is like open and shut. There's no way that this can be disputed. And we've seen time and again where despite our best efforts, right, in terms of being activists, oftentimes the outcome is still not what we think it should be and justice is not served. So I would really encourage you to think about also, if you are stepping into this work or already kind of in the throes of it, is to always be thinking about how that it's making you feel on a personal level. Think about your mental health. Think about what your self-care looks like. Think about what your coping mechanisms look like. How are you literally getting through the moments day to day? How are you receiving the information, the trauma, the experiences that are happening to you on a daily basis? You can't pour from an empty cup. As an activist, you are doing a great service to move forward a social cause and to advocate on behalf of your community or another community. But you can't do that very effectively when you are depleted, when you are burnt out. And activist burnout is so significant. Individuals who have died by suicide that were huge advocates and really impactful activists in their community with regard to various social causes that have died by suicide because they internalized to such a level what was happening around them, what was happening to them, and what's happening to their community. Oftentimes people who come into this space of allyship and activism and just advocacy work overall, it's obviously because you care, right? I would hope so. Those are individuals, human beings, who probably are more likely to be more, empathetic, highly empathetic, or empaths even, more sensitive to the human condition. And because of that, you might be at a higher risk for challenges related to your mental health. So I implore you to take care of yourself. I implore you to be realistic in terms of what you can and can't do and where limitations might exist in this work. Even when we think about folks that have really given everything, given their lives to a particular cause and said, I'm in this and I'm gonna die behind that. That doesn't have to be the narrative. It's not to say that I have to take on that mentality or I don't care as much. That's not the case, right? We want everyone to live a long, healthy life. And that's part of the issue, is that a lot of people are driven to the space of activism because they're seeing those around them not be able to live a long, healthy life, right? So it's like the irony of that, to say that, I probably won't make it to a certain age because I'm on the front lines of calling for social change. But the social change that I'm trying to advocate for is the fact that people that look like me aren't getting to a certain age. Even though the work can't center on one person, we certainly know that there are people that are just so gifted and anointed and have messages that the world needs to hear. And we want them to be able to continue to spread that message for as long as possible. Activism, a lot of people come into it and they are craving instant gratification, right? Like, I spend a lot of time online pulling people together, and tomorrow when I wake up, it should look like this, right? And that's not always realistic. Sometimes it happens like that, but it won't always, especially, again, if you're talking about addressing some of these larger systemic forms of bigotry and oppression in our society, because they didn't happen overnight. They're not going to be eroded or disrupted and dismantled overnight. The process has to be sustained for generations to come.